Hi, I'm Cliff Stieglitz, publisher of Airbrush Action magazine, and about 2 weeks ago we broke the major news that Glen Weisgerber will conduct the pinstriping mastery class at the Airbrush Getaway workshops. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Glen Weisgerber, and I would find that a little hard to believe, but he is a legend in the world of pinstriping and the custom culture. And I know a lot of people throw around the term loosely legend, but he truly is. In fact, he was one of the fathers of New Jersey lettering, pinstriping, and airbrushing. Glen, pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Cliff.
Now I'm going to let you talk because I've just rambled on. Tell me about the legend of New Jersey pinstriping or lettering and airbrushing.
Early on when I started doing lettering, I was basically a commercial truck letterer. I mean, I've always had a love of lettering. And in high school, I got turned on to a sign shop that was near the school. And when I walked in, I was gripped. I just said, listen, I gotta get into this kind of stuff. These guys were in there painting signs. They had these crazy tools like the maul stick, which, you know, I could explain that stuff at the upcoming seminars. But it was just amazing to watch these artists. A lot of them are true artists. They just happen to have a love of lettering like myself. And it was just amazing to watch these guys form these beautiful letters. So I had based my style on maybe 3 or 4 guys in my area. They were old timers, but their style was very classy, you know, less is more, good color choices, nice layouts. And I basically wanted to emulate their style. At that time, I didn't know it was hand lettering, thought it was all decals. But when I got into sign painting and realized that things were hand lettered, I took a second look at these drag cars, knowing that now these are hand lettered. And it would be either through the magazines, and when the magazines weren't good enough, because you can't really see everything in a photograph, I started going down the drag strip and looking at these cars firsthand. And I'm seeing all these effects that were never employed on truck lettering. There was always gold leaf on everything, but there was variegated leaf, which is like a multicolored leaf. And I just liked all the effects that these things gave the lettering. Gave them dimension, punch, contrast, just very dazzling. So at that time, I wanted to be a race car letterer. This is way back. I said, I got to do lettering on race cars. This is really hip. Unfortunately, I was nowhere near any place that was building these cars. A lot of them were out of California, a few of them were up and down the East Coast. And at the time, Mr. J, a good friend of mine, Julian Bryant, he was doing a lot of lettering on race cars for a company called Circus Paint. So when I saw Jules's lettering along with these guys from the West Coast where a lot of cars were being built, I started to study this lettering, you know, firsthand up close. And then I employed it on my truck lettering. And what it was is I was a frustrated race car letterer. So I decided, well, if I can't letter race cars, I can at least put it on trucks. So when my customers would come in, I would immediately say, listen, forget that stuff there. You gotta do this. And they're like, do what? And I would show them some examples of this flashy lettering. And they actually took on to it. They were like, wow, this is cool. Yeah, do up my truck. That's kind of how this whole thing happened. I kind of like flooded the market with this race car custom lettering on commercial vehicles, and eventually it caught on by the next generation of letterers, which came in probably about 10 years later.
And you also mentioned to me before that you were influenced somewhat by the California style, the West Coast style
Yes.
of lettering.
Yeah.
It was almost a hybrid of that, West Coast, East Coast, and then your flavor. Your
Yeah,
spin on it.
there was 3 letterers out on the West Coast when I started that were very well known for the lettering especially on the funny cars. And that was Kenny Youngblood, Nat Quick, and Tom Kelly. And Tom Kelly is actually really, if you want to say the father of race car lettering, he really was the man. I mean, he still is. I mean, the guy does amazing work. He's fast. And he really was the guy that kind of influenced Kenny and Nat. And you could see elements of Kelly's style in there. He's very, very innovative. And what happened was, now in turn, I see Kenny's work and Nat's work, and I take a liking to it. So now I start emulating the style that they actually got from Kelly, and it becomes another generation of that influence. But I would see things like with a Roman letter. The proper Roman letter should start with a thin stroke, a heavy downstroke, another thin upstroke, another heavy downstroke. And this thing would be bass-ackwards. And the same thing would happen with W's. It would start with a thick to a thin to a thick to a thin when it should actually have been flipped. So I would make corrections on these jobs that, there was one, it was an incident where I was doing some touch-up on Tom the Mongoose McEwen's car. And I only needed to do a few little things on his car that he wanted done. And I told him, listen, can I do the Tom McEwen over on the side? He goes, well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's fine. I said, no. The W's backwards. It's bugging the hell out of me. So I actually wanted to do that just because I couldn't stand looking at it.
For free too, right?
Yeah, I said I'm just going to do it for free. I just want to do it. And dreaming of doing them for real.
What impressed me was California, the West Coast had a lot of great talent, there's no question. And yet they were flying you over, race car drivers or some sponsors were flying you over to paint in the West Coast.
I actually started to work for Circus Paint where Jay was lettering.
Yeah.
Jay got busy doing some other stuff at he worked at another commercial sign shop. And I guess he couldn't make it down to a few jobs. And Bob contacted me about doing some lettering, possibly coming down and doing some work for him. Yeah. And I got down there and I started doing the funny cars for Circus. After that, a lot of the cars at that time were locals. They were from up and down the East Coast, which I consider local by the national standard. If they weren't west of the Mississippi, they were people that toured west of the Mississippi. They would actually go out to Pomona,
sure.
Ontario, whatever. And I started doing these jobs, and they were making their way out to the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And people were taking notice of the lettering. Tom Stratton was with Kenny Youngblood, and Tom was a custom painter and a letterer. And they were walking through the pits, and they happened to see a job I did. And Tom looked at Kenny and said, hey, nice job on that car. And Kenny says, I didn't do it, I thought Nat did it. So they both walked over to the car, and they realized nobody out there did it. It was done by this guy, Glenn.
Yeah.
And what happened was I started to get a reputation of, here's a guy from the East Coast that can letter cars that look like they're from the West Coast. The other thing that happened was the word got out that I was very fast at what I do.
Is that one of the big reasons they were flying you out to the West Coast?
Yeah, I think it was that I was fast, but a few of the painters said, we had problems with some guys that would take them 2 weeks to do a car.
Yeah.
And it was because they would have other things going on, whatever they might be, but they would come in, work for a couple days, disappear for a couple days, come back. Or with me, it was just...
Did any of the West Coast artists feel threatened by you?
I don't really think so. I mean...
Did you have a camaraderie with them?
Yeah, I didn't meet Kenny Youngblood till a few years after I was working out there. And I finally met Nat Quick probably a few years after that. And they were all just very welcoming. They just, here's another talented guy.
Sure.
I'd like to just get to know him and be friends with him.
Yeah. By the way, you were recently featured in Hot Rods and Harleys, a great new magazine, a local publisher. Super nice guy. And a quote that I have here that interested me was, you say that all my life I had this thing for symmetry and controlled design.
Right.
But that's changing now, isn't it?
When I was a kid, I used to do a lot of pencil drawings. And for some odd reason, I was always attracted to drawing things with repetitive designs, structural shapes. Mm-hmm. But I used to like to draw, bridges, mm-hmm. truss bridges, everything that had these straight lines with crisscross X's and supports, very structural stuff. I think that's why I gravitated towards lettering and pinstriping, because it was these designs that had symmetry. Everything's got to match both sides perfect. And I think that's why I enjoyed truck lettering and sign painting and race car lettering, what have you, was that one side, I used to pride myself that one side matched the other perfect. I mean, yes. I would measure everything. And I think after a while, I think everybody goes through personality changes. Later in life, you start to realize, why am I trying to control everything in my life? Just let it happen. And I think getting that way on a personal level with just my own spirit, it kind of invaded my way I look at art.
Right.
And suddenly, without this need to control everything around me, which you can't, mm-hmm. you realize, surrender yourself to just a flow. Let things happen. And from that, I found that I was enjoying things that had a starting point and an ending point, but there was no symmetry.
But free form in between.
Yeah.
Like the piece behind us is an example of that, correct?
Yeah.
How would you describe that piece?
They're basically asymmetrical designs. There's a little bit of symmetry, but it's kind of flipped based on like an S curve. But what I like about these is that there's no need to worry about duplicating something exact. So you can let your brush and your mind just flow. Just let things go where they go. And if you make a little mistake somewhere along the line, instead of worrying about, well, do I wipe that off? Do I leave it? And well, in the days of doing symmetrical stuff, if you made a little mistake and it looked good, it's kind of hard to make that mistake happen on the other side. It's never going to happen. That's your hand slips, you sneeze, whatever.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you can just go into something and have what, like Bob Ross, that painter that he used to have a little thing, he called them happy little mistakes.
Yeah.
And he would make them right on the show. He would do something and the brush would slip and he'd go, well, that looks kind of nice. Looks a little bit like a tree. And he would just go with it. And the beauty of it is a lot of artwork has a lot of happy little mistakes in it because it's only a one-off piece of art. You're not worrying about replicating it. So you have that freedom.